It's gone. It was just there. Yesterday, the button I needed vanished. I had just used it several times. I looked over here, and then when my gaze returned, it was gone. What went wrong? Was it a bug? My goal was to adjust the colors that I was using in Adobe XD. Okay. On the left here is the asset panel, and you can put a collection of the colors that you want to be using for your color palette. As you probably know, Adobe XD is a program for creating wireframes. The process is to create something using the colors you like, select it, and then click on this plus sign. I'd been tweaking the colors and then put it into an external program that calculates the amount of contrast between various shades. So when I was ready to add a color, the plus sign had vanished. So I had to search the screen to see what cues there were that could help me figure out what had happened to the button. Any computer user has run into this type of situation far too often. The other items in this pane, the character styles and components, still have their plus signs. Solving the mystery of the missing plus sign includes understanding the underlying problem. The deep issue is one of cues. This is a particularly insidious design problem. This is one of those things that you can see in two different ways. Had it been another day, I might have looked the other way, and I'd have never been aware of the problem at all. Most products from Adobe use a minimalist design style. This is very clean, yet there are multiple cues for each tool in order to help users with the complexity. Adobe XD has a Spartan design, which makes for a very clean appearance. A Spartan design requires a well-trained user who needs very few cues to know what comes next. How many cues do you need to identify what this is? When presented with something, no matter how familiar it is, what we see can be influenced by what we expect to see or what we have recently seen. Did you know that you can influence which version someone sees by priming? Priming is a lot like foreshadowing in a movie script, where you expose the viewer to a small cue in advance. It will influence how something ambiguous will be interpreted later on. I'll explain more about this in a future episode. Is this cat going up the stairs or down the stairs? This scene is missing visual cues that we normally use to put context to what we are seeing. If I add an additional cue, you might never have been aware that there was another way to view this image. Ambiguous images or wording can be a huge problem for designers. It's made worse because the entire team is primed to see the same view. A bit later, I'll let you know how to prevent this from happening. Any user, including the designer, might see the other view if they see it in another context where the cues better match the second archetype. My definition of an archetype is a two-dimensional eye-level view of an object with just the minimal information needed to recognize what type of object it is. This is a shortcut our minds use to identify classes of objects quickly. There are unique combinations of lines, curves, angles, and relationships that define one class as distinct from another. We then remember how the instance we see now is different from the archetype in our heads. Here is a picture of Nikola Tesla. The archetype is a person, a human face, then varies from a default face since it is narrower than average and has sharper features. Archetypes are surprisingly similar from person to person. Researchers have also found that the core elements of an archetype can be defined in as few as 16 pixels on a screen. Does it surprise you that this is the smallest size for a computer icon? So designing a user interface is really about designing cues so that the user knows which archetype to use to successfully use your design. If they understand the same archetype that you intended, they should know how to use the feature. When I looked at the Assets panel in Adobe XD, the archetype that I saw was a menu. So what is the archetype for a menu? The generic menu is rectangular. It has a list of words or phrases aligned in a consistent fashion. A menu is an important part of the application structure or framework. Generally, there are visual cues to help users tell the difference between the application framework and the regions with content. In Adobe XD, the content area would be the areas like the artboards where the user creates content. Okay, we talked about priming or foreshadowing. What had I seen before I came to this screen? I had seen this region of the screen, which very much acted like a menu. My problem in Adobe XD was made worse because the plus sign was not visible. I will show you an example of how missing cues can cause even more problems than ambiguous cues. Let's return to our image of the young Nikola Tesla. This picture is a little different from the one I first showed you. How long does it take you to find what is missing? Shaving off a mustache is very hard for people to recognize. Even if you recall that he had a mustache, it's hard to recall what type of mustache he had. People readily notice that something looks different, but the mustache is generally an afterthought in how you identify a face. It's a low-level detail. The missing plus sign in Adobe XD is a lot like Tesla's mustache. Once I recalled where it should be, it still was hard to recall all the nuances of what should have been there. With the plus sign missing, this looks even more like a menu than it did before. The XD designers would point out that the narrow line should have been enough of a cue. A straight line is a weak cue. Design wizards recognize that one cue on its own can be easily misunderstood. It looks to me like Adobe XD actually used the archetype for a scrolling content field. What are the cues for the scrolling content archetype? The length of the text exceeds the content space in the panel or window. The scroll bar is like a zipper. There is a track that extends the length of the area. The traditional scroll bar is a part of the application frame. It is visually separate from the content and appears on the right-hand side. The beginning and the end points are clearly identified and correspond to the beginning and the end of the content. A slider marks the progress through the content. Scrolling fields are common in desktop applications. Desktop applications tend to be complex. The screens are filled with tools that compete for the user's attention. This is why most of them choose to use a more traditional scrolling field design. This Photoshop panel has all the expected cues for a scrolling window. The top and bottom are clearly marked, as are the track and the slider. The scrolling in Photoshop appears to be on a layer that is physically separate from the application frame. It appears like the content scrolls underneath the edge. Mobile devices have tiny screens and the apps are rarely very complex. On handheld devices, the scroll bar appears as a single narrow line with no distinct top or bottom. Many times, it's even omitted. Adobe XD designers chose the narrow line model as the only cue that this is a scrolling window. I don't see any cues for what will or won't scroll. When the content scrolls, it vanishes. Our brains work best with models that correspond to the real world. Our minds quickly identify things that move together as a single object. The things that don't move are something else. I call the stationary parts the application framework. The content areas are parts that move and would have to be on another plane or layer if they were objects in the physical world. In the latest upgrade, Adobe made sure that after scrolling, the text is always cut off to provide a second cue that content has scrolled out of sight. I think the fact that they are working on this problem so quickly is an indication of how important it is to have sufficient cues for your interface. Before we conclude, I want to show you some minor changes that can dramatically improve the user experience with the Assets panel. To me, the biggest issue is the lack of distinction between what is content and what is application structures. This lack of distinction is what made my brain decide in the moment that the panel contained a menu, which would be part of the application framework. This sample version of the Assets panel demonstrates how little has to change in order to include all the essential cues for the archetypes that we discussed. The plus tool is always available and is now clearly a part of the application framework. The scrolling content fields now have multiple cues for redundancy, while the overall design retained the original shapes, colors, and even the narrow line for the scroll bar. The design wizard techniques are very subtle changes that make huge differences. I added faint separation lines. These cue that the group names and the plus signs are part of the framework layer. They will always remain on the screen. So this covers the cues for the application layer. A simple rectangle is enough to suggest an opening in the application layer, where we can view the scrolling content area that appears to move underneath the application layer. If we alter the shade of the rectangle, it will emphasize this effect. Using the same shade as the main content area creates a strong visual link and the illusion that my content lives on a separate layer from the application. This same rectangle leaves just a sliver of application color right down the side. It becomes a track for the slider. The top and bottom of the content and the track are very clear. Now we have cues for the key parts of the scrolling content archetype. A single rectangle and 2 lines was all it took to solve the problem of the missing plus sign. This solution separates the content from the application framework and clearly cues how each part will function. This is an example of how to fix a single screen. Too often fixes are done in isolation, like I did here, as if each page were an individual piece of art. Wizard design is about creating products that are built with the structural integrity you would find in a movie script, where every part is a facet of the whole. The design wizard who understands the role of archetypes creates magical designs that work. To see more episodes of A Design Wizard's Guide, please like, subscribe, and if you would, please share this episode with others.